All right, so this is the first album I think we're covering that technically right now is not in the top 100 albums and best ever albums. It's moved down a few slots. It's now 104 on best ever albums. It comes in at number 8 in 1976, number 429 of all time, and in Rolling Stone's list it comes in at number 288. So I'm going to do a little bio on this band. Modern Lovers is mainly the brainchild of a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Richman, who grew up about 25 miles from where I'm sitting right now in Natick, Massachusetts. He began playing his guitar and writing songs when he was in his mid-teens. And he was infatuated with two bands. He was two very influential bands that we have covered on CTS. Can either of you, Josh is nodding his head. I think you might know at least one of them, Josh.
Yes.
Pretty sure I can guess both, but
okay.
We'll
Go for it, John.
Go for it, John.
Yeah.
I'm going to guess the Velvet Underground.
Yep.
And the Doors.
No, but that is a good guess.
Okay.
Nope. There was another band a little later. It doesn't really, I would say that they don't really sound like it, but I did read that he was very much influenced by this band.
Well, the only other band they sounded like were all bands after them. So those are the only two that I heard distinctly. Yeah.
It wouldn't be the Stooges, would it?
It would be the Stooges,
All
Josh.
right.
Okay. Well, yeah, I could see that.
Big fan of the Stooges, but this album does not really sound like the Stooges much at all. So he's a big fan of the Velvet Underground. He graduates from high school in 1969, and he heads to New York and somehow meets the Velvet Underground, becomes friendly with them, and he opens some shows for them on his own.
He's like a super fan, by the way, I think, of the Velvet Underground.
Such a super fan, Josh, that for a couple of weeks in his stay in New York, he slept on the Velvet Underground's manager's couch, Steve Sesnick. So he spent some time on Sesnick's couch.
This would have been between the second self-titled Velvet Underground and Loaded, right? That would have been the time when he was interacting with them, I think.
69 into 70 is what we're looking at here.
How old was he at that time?
Yeah.
Do you know?
He just graduated high school, so he was like 18.
He's 18. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, okay.
Yep. So he's after about 9 months in New York, he comes back to the Boston area, and he starts a band with his buddy, by a guy by the name of John Felice, and they also recruit a drummer by the name of David Robinson, not the basketball player, and another guy, Rolf Anderson, and they call themselves the Modern Lovers, and they start playing. Not the dog, right. Thank you, Josh. Yes, very good, important distinction.
Dog. Not a donkey. Go ahead, sorry.
So they play their first date in September of 1970, about a month after Richman gets back from New York, so they jump right into it. Richman had a unique persona. He had short hair, wore a jacket and tie, and he improvised the different lyrics into his songs, and he had improvised monologues in between songs, and kind of had a unique presence on stage. In early 1971, Felice and Anderson leave the band, and then they were replaced by bassist Ernie Brooks and keyboardist Jerry Harrison. And this rounds out the classic version of the Modern Lovers and the guys that play on this particular record. So they're playing a bunch of shows in Boston. By word of mouth, they were discovered by a man named Stuart Love from Warner Brothers Records, who contacted the band and arranged for them to go to the studio and record a multi-track demo. And the demo and their live performances helps them gain some more traction, this time with A&M Records, and they go to L.A. in April of 1972, and they hold two different demo sessions. One is produced by John Cale for Warner Brothers, and the other is produced by Alan Mason for A&M. They couldn't decide who to sign. Go ahead.
So he got John Cale to do. Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, your idol.
Yeah. So John Cale. Yeah, and like I said, they knew each other a little bit in New York. He opened for them, so there was a connection there already. And Cale was doing other productions. So yeah, so they do. And these were just demos that they were cutting at the time. They weren't exactly which of the record companies to sign with, so they go back to Boston. They play a New Year's Eve show where they are supported by the New York Dolls. So there's another connection to CTS there. Mm-hmm. And in early 1973, they actually did get signed by Warner Brothers, and they did ask John Cale to work with them again to produce the record. Before they do this, they took up a residency at a hotel in Bermuda for a time period, which I thought was kind of interesting. And but they do return to California to record with Cale, and almost immediately there starts to be a lot of personality differences and arguments that arise. And mainly this stems from Richmond's desire at the time to really kind of rein in the rock and roll that the band had been playing for all this time and go in more of a acoustic direction. And he cited several reasons for this. Some are kind of unbelievable. One was that he was concerned about the fossil fuels that are required to power the electric instruments and all of the energy used to record albums. So he was trying to strip down from that.
God, can you imagine what you think about recording now?
I know.
Jesus.
I know. He was very ahead of his time.
Blown.
Yeah, he didn't want to profit from the lifestyle of the rock and roll, the rock and roll lifestyle. He made comments about not wanting people to having people's ears damaged during a show, and he was kind of just a contrarian, really. There was one point where the song Roadrunner is becoming more and more popular, and as it becomes more popular on stage, he decides, you know what, I'm not going to play this anymore. And so the band is really frustrated by this, and so is John Cale. They're thinking that, we got something here. We got some really good songs. We're a really good band. We're on the cusp of doing something great, and you're trying to ruin this. But
can you imagine being a little bit too temperamental and not artistic enough for John Cale? It's like, whoa,
yeah.
hold on. But
hold on, you're blowing
we need to be
my
a little
mind.
bit more commercial. Sorry, we need to be a little more commercial here.
Yeah. He's like, I don't want to be part of a conventional rock band, and that was driving everybody nuts. So he also thought the acoustic nature of more toned down sound would also help people understand the lyrics a little bit better. So it's driving everybody nuts, and they're trying to talk him out of it. It's not happening. It's just not who Richmond was at the time or what he wanted to do. So eventually he tells Warner Brothers, he's like, look, I'll play these songs, or I'll record these songs for you, but I'm not going to play them live. So he wanted to almost totally take them out of the catalog, or out of the set list. And Warner Brothers becomes so frustrated that they end up dropping the band in 1974, and the band shortly thereafter splits up. So he goes on. Richmond signs on as a solo artist in late 1974 with Matthew Kaufman from A&M Records, and this is where he goes on to form Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers, and they released their album in 1976, which is what Jonathan Richman says is the true debut album of the Modern Lovers. This album that we're covering tonight is actually a collection of the songs that were recorded in 1971 and 1972 when they recorded in California for those demo sessions with John Cale and the other one with A&M Records. So even though this album was released in 1976, and essentially that was done by that the record label guy Matthew Kaufman from A&M Records, he basically just compiled all those songs and put them out as the Modern Lovers album. So and that's released really back to back between that and the Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers album. So Richmond doesn't acknowledge this album that we're covering tonight as the debut album, and it's really just the collection of those demos. So really, they're recorded in 1971 and 1972, but released 4 or 5 years later. So, so that's all the question marks surrounding the true nature of this album. So, but I thought that was really interesting because I don't think we've covered an album that's really quite had a history like that before. So a couple of other things. So after this album's released, it's met with pretty much immediate critical praise. Went on to influence a number of aspiring musicians, including tonight's very own Sex Pistols, who covered a version of Roadrunner. And vocalist Johnny Rotten has said that, I found this quote somewhere, he said, although he, quote, hates all music, Roadrunner is his favorite song of all time. And that
won't be the last of his comments tonight, by the way.
I can't wait. Yeah. He actually, you guys can find the Sex Pistols covering Roadrunner on YouTube, and it's really funny because Rotten doesn't really remember the lyrics, and half the time he's like, "What are the lyrics? What am I singing?" And at one point he's like, "Do we know any other Beatles songs?" He's just totally riffing on it. He keeps saying the same thing over and over again. It's really funny. Roadrunner was also covered by Wire, I would say that, and recently in Rolling Stone's top 500 songs of all time that was released, I don't know, maybe a couple months ago, Roadrunner was listed as the number 77th song of all time. So it's and it was modeled after the Velvet Underground song Sister Ray. the beginning part, right? Sister Ray, the very beginning guitar part is Richmond admitted that he basically just stole it from that.
Also, MIA samples Roadrunner.
Yes, you're right, Josh. Very good. Very good. And in a retrospective write-up for AllMusic, Stephen Thomas Erlewine states that, quote, the combination of musical simplicity, driving rock and roll, and gawky emotional confessions makes The Modern Lovers one of the most startling proto-punk records. It strips rock and roll to its core and establishes the rock tradition of the geeky, awkward social outcast venting his frustrations. And one more fun fact I will give you before we taking over to your reactions. 2 other members of the Modern Lovers went on to become members of very famous bands themselves. Jerry Harrison. Either of you guys know what band he went on to help form or help contribute to?
I do not.
Talking Heads.
Oh.
He's a member of the Talking Heads.
Wow.
He was the keyboardist and guitarist for the Talking Heads. And David Robinson, drummer for the Cars. Became the drummer for the Cars. So everybody, people were pretty successful. Yeah.
I know they're from Boston. Yeah, the Cars, right? They're from Massachusetts.
Yes,
that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And I think Talking Heads met at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design. New England. So there you go. All right. So Modern Lovers. I am curious to know what Josh thinks about this record.
Okay. So, is this the first album that we've covered that is like directly influenced by bands that we've covered in like a direct connection, and the fact that he's sleeping on their floor and stuff? Are we reaching
maybe to that degree?
To that degree, you mean?
Where like kids are now like being influenced by the bands that we've covered on the show.
Well, like Aerosmith was clearly like influenced by Led Zeppelin, right?
Yeah, true.
And like there's other like. I'm sure some of the female singer-songwriters with Laura Nyro and the Beatles, yes, I mean, there's some. But I hear what you're saying, that they went and grabbed the producer of the band they led.
Right.
Yeah. Or a member of, I should say.
Well,
yeah.
And this is also one of those guys that not many people bought the Velvet Undergrounds, but they went out and started bands, and that's basically, Modern Lovers is one of those bands.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, true. So I have mixed feelings about this album. On the one hand, I really like the music. I like the sounds that he brings. It does sound very stripped down on this album, but on the other hand, I really don't like Jonathan Richman's voice, and he doesn't sing very well, and it's kind of, he speaks at times. We've talked about that a little bit before. This is almost like the first emo album, because I paid attention to the lyrics on all 3 of these albums this week, and he is definitely writing confessionally, like Matt said. He's writing about sex and love and longing. That seems to be the driving themes through most of his songs.
He really wants a girlfriend, doesn't he?
He does. In fact, he spells it out.
I think he spells it out.
And spells it wrong.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's all, there's no subtext. It's all very like in your face and plain as day what he's writing about. So from that aspect, it's not, he's not reinventing the wheel that way, but there is something about the music that I am drawn to. Roadrunner being the primary example of that. He and the band have a way with making a melody or making something that is catchy, and that kind of comes through over and over again in this album. I would say Roadrunner is the strongest of the songs on this, and now that I know it's the demos, essentially, I can see why this album doesn't feel fully formed. It almost doesn't feel like a debut album in some respects. I don't think there's enough strong songs on here for it to be well, I mean, it wasn't intended as a complete album, right?
Well, the intention, I think, was to go into the studio with Cale and do it the real like record a proper album, but anything that they recorded just never really worked out. So this is what they were left with. So if they did the album, it probably would have been similar to this, though, is my understanding, or my guess at least. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. He also writes a lot about Boston, Massachusetts. I could have told you he was from there because he says it so many times.
He sure does.
And so yeah, the lyrics are repetitive also, to his detriment. They're not, he's not writing Patti Smith type lyrics, that's for sure. And so, But the more I listened to the album, the more I was kind of drawn in by it. It's not a very long album. I think there's only 8 or 10 songs on it.
9.
9. And I think it's worth listening to, but it's not an album that I was like blown away by or thought necessarily needed further listening. It's not a deep dive album like we've talked about with some other of the albums. It's pretty self-effacing, I guess, is my point. What about you guys? What do you think, John?
What about you, John?
So I like this album's very interesting because it definitely requires multiple listens. I can tell you that because my take on it the first time and the second, it's the rare album I listened to 3 times in the week because, like Josh said, it goes by quickly, and I felt I needed the 3 listens to get something different out of it. I think the first time I listened to it, I've never liked the song Roadrunner. It's the one song I was definitely familiar with here. I know it's their big song. I've never liked it, and it's also been covered a jillion times by bands I like, and every time I'm like, it's like I okay, whatever.
So you don't think it's the 77th best song of all time, John?
Not for me. And Astral Plane, I actively dislike. It sounds like a bad Doors song, is how I would describe that. However, once we get past there, the run of Pablo Picasso, She Cracked, and Hospital is an awesome run of 3 songs. You want to talk about going in like Josh said, there's proto emo in terms of the lyrics for sure. There's nothing kind of cool about him like there was about the Velvet Underground, right? It's kind of like that cool, awkward sort of like pathetic a little bit almost at times by design narrative, I'd say, where it sounds sort of like the New Romantic vibe, but sung by a guy who's actively not playing it cool, So from that end of things, it kind of it was very interesting because this album reminded me of so many different things, and also drew me to me clear, like Stooges and Velvet Underground totally makes sense. I think Doors is in there too because there's elements of that, like how he's almost like deconstructing he's like the sexless lead singer to Jim Morrison's like sexed up lead singer, But I heard elements of like that 2000s emo that like Fall Out Boy and those type bands did, albeit those bands had like real soaring singers, but the sort of the lyrical content of this stuff and sort of the general vibe to me reminded me of that. This also had a lot of noise rock elements. If you've ever heard the replace, so like the noise rock's like a Sonic Youth type. It's funny that we mentioned Thurston Moore earlier because there's definite like Sonic Youth noise rock type elements to this for sure. Jesus and Mary Chain, not as dark and like distorty, but sort of like the circular guitars like that they're doing and sort of the offbeat work, right?
Well, there is distortion in like the keys and guitars that kind of, to an extent, that kind of foreshadows that, I would say. Yeah.
Absolutely. This also reminded me a little bit of what later the Replacements did, because the Replacements kind of took like the Big Star feel and sort of merged it with these types of confessional lyrics with a different sound. So I heard a little bit of that in there as well. I like this album more each time I listen to it, but I would describe this album for me as more of a curiosity than a pure love of an album. It's a curiosity in the sense that I found it interesting, and I also found it almost more interesting as a cultural touch point than I did necessarily as a body of music, if that makes sense. Because it almost feels like someone said, okay, with the references you guys yourself grew up with, right? Your music, and then the stuff you've listened to so far, stick something right in the middle of that. Like, I feel like this album represents right where what we've covered mixed with right what were the things that influenced us. So, I would give it a slight thumbs up, but I definitely would recommend Pablo Picasso and She Cracked in particular. I like a lot. I could do with that. The songs I disliked, like Astral Plane and Girlfriend and in particular, I don't love those songs. Modern World had elements that I liked too as well. And it really was like the songs I liked a lot, and then the songs I didn't like were kind of like, oh, that's kind of a failed experiment for me. Yeah. I don't necessarily like the keyboards in this. I would have taken them out. They intrude a little bit on the pieces. I think it would be better as just sort of more guitar driven stuff.
I like the organ in this. I think that
that's what it is. Organ. Yeah. Sorry, I said keyboard, but it's really more organ, isn't it? That's why I think I got the Doors vibe on Astral Plane quite a bit.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I first heard of Jonathan Richman. I don't know if you guys knew, but he, in Something About Mary, in that movie, if you've seen that, where there are several times throughout the movie where they would finish a scene and they would cut to this guy playing the guitar, kind of like singing what just happened in the scene or whatever. That's Jonathan Richman. And that was the first time I had heard of him. A friend of mine mentioned, "Oh yeah, that's this guy from this band Modern Lovers." I'm like, I'd never heard of him, and that's how I first heard.
So were the Farrelly brothers a fan of? They must be a fan.
I would assume so. Yes. Yeah. And he's been I think he's done some other quasi acting things before as well. But it's kind of funny too, because when he's playing, you could totally tell like he's not in sync with the music that's playing. Like he's strumming his guitar, and you could tell it's totally offbeat. So it's like a really horrible like lip syncing kind of job, and it's done on purpose like that. And then I knew Roadrunner, I knew Pablo Picasso. Those were songs. I think Superfan Kevin put Pablo Picasso onto the mix for me once, and I heard Roadrunner somewhere else. So I knew what I was getting into with this album. I knew that he's kind of like, a lot of his stuff is tongue in cheek. He's kind of like a goofball. You know, the lyrics are kind of like, not really terribly serious, although they are somewhat confessional. So he's got that voice that's kind of like what you're describing, Josh. It's kind of goofy, so I kind of knew what I was getting into with that. So I like this record a lot, and I think it's interesting knowing that the songs were recorded 4 or 5 years prior to its release. So it's kind of it's not really a 1976 album. It's more of a 1971, 72 album. And you're absolutely right, John. I was picking up those keyboards. I'm thinking the Doors, so this has that, not just the Doors, but also just that kind of that 60s psychedelic, there's some sounds on here that would fit in well in that Nuggets, compilation that we listened to,
Yeah. It's got a little bit of that like 50s, 60s rock and roll deal that the Velvet Underground used to delve back into too. Yeah.
Yeah, like in the little like garage rock kind of thing like that. So you definitely it's got a little bit of that dated sound, and I would attribute that mostly to the organ, like you guys talked about. And then there's stuff in here that it's like proto indie rock as well. So I think that's an interesting point that you made, John, about how it's kind of like, it's really kind of in the middle of stuff. It's really referencing some of the stuff that we've covered from the 60s and and early 70s, and then what would come later on with punk rock, with indie rock, with kind of like a lo-fi, low budget production kind of thing. And I think it works out really well. I like the mix of stuff. I think Hospital's a really good song.
I like that chorus in that.
Yeah, there's something about and it's just, and the lyrics in that are kind of like they're interesting, And I was laughing at Girlfriend. Like some of these songs, he talks about like, just, I really want a girlfriend, I don't want, and what is it? Someone I care about. He's singing like, I don't want a girl just to ball. You know? So dumb. So I laugh because it's you could tell he's earnest in the sense that like he's nostalgic for Massachusetts and loves the area. He really wants a relationship. He wants to feel connection, but he also does it in a really goofy way that's just like, it makes you laugh and smile throughout. But it's a lot. But melodically, I think there's a lot of really catchy stuff. I like Roadrunner a lot. I think that's I love the end when the band's going radio on and it just builds and stuff like that. So I think I really do like that song. Pablo Picasso is just a really interesting kind of like indie rock, song about just how he must have gotten all these girls and was never called an asshole.
Well, and he was short. That was the other thing that he made. It was amazing that he got all these women, even though he was. I think he specifically says 5'3", like
right.
Because one thing about his lyrical content, he repeats it enough times.
Yes, he does.
Even if you don't listen to lyrics, Matt, I imagine you got many of these.
I did. Yeah, that was very easy. But I agree. She Cracked was kind of a cool like. I don't know if it's, but that's the weird thing. I don't know. There's some of the stuff, it sounds like it's kind of punk, but it's not really punk. I mean, it's not like in the terms of like the Clash or the Sex Pistols that we're going to talk about tonight, So I see a lot of different elements of things in here, and I really liked it. I didn't really find a weak song on here, and it's got some variety. There's some slower songs like Girlfriend and Hospital, and then there's more upbeat stuff as well. So I like this quite a bit. I think it's really interesting, and and I wanted to learn more about Richmond. I was trying to find a documentary on them, but I didn't really see any. And I know he goes on to he's done a bunch of stuff with Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers, and then he has done a bunch of solo stuff. And I don't really, really know a whole lot of that. But for this record, I thought the story was really interesting, and I really did like this album a lot. It's got a lot of catchy hooks, and I like the production. Like that kind of that lo-fi kind of that production. Even though that might have been not have been what they have intended to do because they wanted to make a proper album, but I still think it sounds pretty great. So I'm a thumbs up on this. I like this album a lot.
I think it's interesting. If it was actually released in 71 or 72, how we probably would have talked about it differently, or how much of an impact, because it does, if we think about it in that context, it does sound kind of ahead of its time in terms of this stripped down style, but also kind of being proto punk and emo. So that's interesting to think about. I also wonder, have you listened to that what he considers the official follow-up album?
No, I wanted to, but you can't find it. It's not. It's one of those like Captain Beefheart albums that's not on Spotify. I mean, there's Jonathan Richman and Modern Lovers albums, but not that one. It's not, and I couldn't find it on YouTube either. So I might actually have to buy that one.
Okay. Well, report back once you listen
old
to
school. I'm like a grandfather, and I have to buy an album.
Go to like a record store. Somebody will have it at a record
vinyl.
store.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So, John, were you were positive also, you think, as well? I'm kind of in the middle overall.
I would say slight positive, yes.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah,
by the way, you guys know Trout Mask Replica is on Spotify now.
Oh, I did see that. I did see that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's the Combing the Stacks bump right there.
So this is the last time. This is the only time we're covering the Modern Lovers, and it's technically out of the well, we would have covered it in a cold listen anyway because it is on Rolling Stone's list. But it's a highly regarded album. It did go on to help influence other people, and Jonathan Richman's an interesting dude. Just this curmudgeon that kind of wants to buck the system at all whenever he can. So
he doesn't want to be in a popular band.
Somebody should
sentiment.
I would love to see a documentary on that. That's a total that would be an interesting thing to see. So yeah, Josh, get on that.
All right, let me call him up.
Yeah.